M1928/31, which I honestly think are really underrated tanks. I mean, in terms of design, it's not like they were the best tanks ever, but I mean, they were the first to really use the Christie Suspension, which is one of the most influential suspension systems ever designed. So I think it deserves a bit more credit, but we'll get onto that further into the video. To provide some backstory, Christie's original attempts to create a tank was the M1919 seen to the left, and its sort of upgraded model, the M1921, and yes, that is a turretless tank seen to the right. It was a good first start for someone who had never designed a tank before, but it was refused, mainly because of its unreliability and how hard it was to maneuver. Christie wasn't really disheartened though and would continue on, introducing his better Christie Suspension, a brand new suspension system with his next designs. To give some information on the Christie Suspension, in case you didn't know, it was an amazing step up, being much more advanced and just better overall than a simple leaf spring or bogey suspension system that other tanks were using, which were awful. But I mean, this thing was just way better. It basically had a wheel that was carried on a pivoting arm, the little red thing seen below, supported by a coil spring. It also had rubber wheels, which not only gave it a further level of suspension, but it was also quieter on the road. So this tank was one of the first tanks to actually ever be possibly used in a stealth role. I mean, it wouldn't be effective at all on a stealth role, but with other tanks it was absolutely impossible because I mean it was just too damn loud. There's a picture of Christie above because I just think he looks cool in that picture. The tank was able to drive without its tracks, with power to the rear wheel, though it would take a full half hour to swap between the tracks and wheel configurations. This convertible idea, though, was really popular with Christie, who was a race car designer before he moved to tanks, so he kind of liked the idea of a tank being able to switch to just using wheels. It had about 12 millimeters of armor and weighed about 8.5 tons, yet easily had the best speeds of any armored vehicle in the 1920s. I mean, it would be shown off with just a dummy gun and a spot for a machine gun in the crew compartment, being shown for the first time on October 28, 1928. It would go through tests with the tank board, and on November 19, 1928, it proved an average speed of 28 miles per hour. You might be thinking, oh, I mean, that's better for the time, but I mean, it's not crazy. Though, without tracks, it reached the high speed of 70 miles an hour, which is absolutely insane for the time. And with tracks, even a 42 mile per hour speed. I mean, this was just revolutionary speed for the tank of this time. I mean, a tank being able to go this fast was just unheard of. Christie would call his tank the M1940, saying it was 12 years ahead of his time, but the tank board of the Ordnance Department really didn't buy this and wasn't impressed with the vehicle. They said the armor was too thin, but they did give Christie a chance to modify the tank on its own, which would lead to the M1931 model. With a 37mm gun and a revolving turret, they'd be known as the M1931. Though with the cavalry, since the cavalry wasn't technically allowed to have tanks, which were all given to the infantry, it would be known as the Combat Car T1, while the infantry would be known as the Convertible Medium Tank T3. 7 would be produced, though Christie and the Army would forever have a notoriously bad relationship with each other, and that would result in no more being produced. The cavalry's version would be given a machine gun instead of a cannon in the combat car version, while the T3 itself would have a two-man crew with a 137mm gun and a machine gun. Its armor ranged from 12 to 15 millimeters, being able to go 45 miles per hour on wheels and 27 miles per hour tracked. Once again, this was just stellar for its time. There was a variant, the T3E2, of which 5 were ordered by Christie. It gave the driver a .30mm machine gun, .30-inch machine gun, a flatter and wider nose, as well as a wider sloped two-man duplex turret, which was becoming increasingly popular for the time. It also had one machine gun in the right, left, and rear of the turret, so it's a total of 4 machine guns and 1 main gun, which would arguably start the trend of let's just slap a machine gun wherever we can. A better engine allowed it to go from 27 miles per hour while tracked to a good 35 miles per hour, both of which, I mean, in comparison, let's just say the Medium Mark II could go like 15, and if I remember right, the Vickers 6-ton, sorry, I'm just trying to think, I'm totally blanking right now. The Vickers 6-ton could go a good like 21, 22 miles per hour, so it was still above that. In terms of exports, I mean, this never really became an export tank like the 6-ton would. One was sold to Poland, but disagreements led to it never being delivered. Though the Polish 10 TP tank would use a variant of the Christie suspension system. The Soviets illegally bought two complete models. Christie basically sold... What the hell? Christie illegally sold it to them for $60,000. And because it wasn't illegal, they'd be sent turtless as quote-unquote agricultural tractors, which was a very German thing for him to do. Soviet engineers, after trials, would say, the Christie tank, in the form in which it was presented at the trials, is a highly interesting machine with universal movement. But it requires extensive development as a fighting machine and the introduction of a number of design improvements and changes. Yes, my Russian accent is amazing, I agree. These tanks would eventually become the highly influential Soviet BT series, as seen on the left, which I think this one is the BT-5. Christie would also sell prototypes to the British, who did like the suspension but completely reworked everything else to the Cruiser Mark III. This would be the final M1931 he sold, as he'd actually continue making new designs until 1942, when he would be 75 years old. I mean, that's pretty damn old to still be doing new designs. Unfortunately, though, none would ever really have as much success, and he died at age 77 2 years later, which is a bummer, of course, because this man was just a legend. In terms of final assessments, the Christie M1928 and 1931 would technically be failures, but they would be highly influential. Their suspensions would spread like absolute wildfire, and by the end of World War II, they'd be the best suspensions available. The Soviet and British ones used the Christie suspension in their BT and cruiser tanks, and even the Polish used a variant with their 10TP. So while the tank designs themselves weren't very successful, the suspensions they brought to the spotlight definitely were.